Hello everyone.
In this video, I'd like to dig deeper into the Skull Knight, which has already had a lot of discussion. Who is he? What kind of cause and effect does he have? And what is his purpose? There are too many mysteries, so let's get started. For now, I'd like to review the most popular theories which have been discussed already. The most famous one is that the Skull Knight is the former Supreme King Geyserik. Charlotte told us a famous fairy tale that says Geyserik, who built a great empire 1,000 years ago, used to wear scary skull armor. And Guts, who heard this story, also thought of the Skull Knight. In the story, the king who had committed tyranny was touched by the wrath of God, and God sent 4 or 5 angels to destroy the whole empire. And as Zod says, the apostles in God Hand, they've been enemies for 1,000 years. This episode corresponds to the timeline. I think this is the most likely theory, because Slan refers to him as the king in Qlipoth. When the memory of the Berserker armor was awakened, the Skull Knight said, "The end of a foolish king, and beginning of a dead man stalking the endless night." And that memory is the one of the previous owner of the armor. In other words, it's the memory of the Skull Knight. I think this theory is almost confirmed. In the scene of the eclipse in the memory of the Berserker armor, the one standing in the middle is the current chief angel Void. In this eclipse, the one who became the God Hand is presumed to be Void. In the Midland fairy tales, as Mazga said, it was the tortured wise man who summoned the angel, so the wise man equals Void. Void's character is sculpted with an abnormally large brain, and a face that appears to have been tortured. It fits the image of a wise man. And then, I see a huge brand floating on the ground in the distance behind the Lady Priestess of the Cherry Blossoms, who was branded as a sacrifice. If we think that this is the entire empire that Geyserik founded, Void was a wise man who cared for his country in the first place. But he and Geyserik, who had tyrannized, had not got along with each other. After he was tortured, Void summoned the God Hand and sacrificed the entire empire, including Geyserik. I think it makes sense. Or Harnal said that she would show how the Berserker armor devoured life. Geyserik was not killed by the apostles because of the eclipse of Void reincarnation, but rather by the power of the Berserker armor. But if we go with this theory, there is a contradiction. When Griffith became a God Hand, there were 4 other God Hands. Each of them reincarnates as a God Hand every 216 years. That means Void became a God Hand 864 years ago. The Skull Knight, who's been avenging them for 1,000 years, had confronted them for 136 years before that. What's the meaning of this difference? I'd like to think about it.
There was another big event that took place 1,000 years ago. It was the once-in-a-thousand-year incarnation of the God Hand. In Volume 26, Slan, who manifested in Qlipoth, spoke to the Skull Knight. You know what it means, don't you? This is what it means to be the 5th person to appear. The worlds have already begun to overlap. The expression overlapping worlds in this context means the present world, which is the range of human perception, overlaps the astral world, which is the habitat of monsters unrecognizable to humans, and the boundary between the two is becoming blurred. The 5th person is Griffith in the current situation, and he achieved incarnation. The God Hand that incarnates is always the 5th, and it blurs the boundary between the present world and the astral world, and that's what the Skull Knight knows. And Void became a God Hand 864 years ago. So there's another God Hand who incarnated before that. The one who incarnated 1,000 years ago was the Supreme King Geyserik, aka the Skull Knight, wasn't he? I've thought about a lot of things until I reached this conclusion. So far, this theory seems to be the most plausible. First, Void was reincarnated as a God Hand 864 years ago, so he can't be an incarnation. 1,000 years ago, there was a continent that had been ravaged by warring factions. Geyserik was the only one in history to conquer it in a single lifetime, but there is no record of his origins. In other words, he came out of nowhere, conquered an entire continent, and created a great empire. After Charlotte told Guts that story, he said, "It's like Griffith. What he said in the monologue is exact. It's so consistent with Griffith's actions after the incarnation, isn't it? Furthermore, if the setting goes as the 5th God Hand is a transcendent human who has incarnated and returned to this world, I don't think it's unreasonable for him to be alive after 136 years of the eclipse of the God Hand reincarnation."
There are other factors that lead to this conclusion. Mr. Miura said, "I'm going to fold up what I have expanded" in an interview at the Big Berserk exhibition. Thinking from this statement, I don't think he's going to introduce a new character who can be involved with the basis of the story. So the person who incarnated 1,000 years ago may have been introduced already. As you can see from the concept of law of cause and effect emphasized throughout the story, we can assume this is a story in which similar events are repeated. When we think so, Geyserik and Griffith after his incarnation have a lot in common. It seems natural to think that the incarnation of 1,000 years ago might be him. If that's the case, Geyserik was a former God Hand. It means that the former God Hand after incarnation can be sacrificed to the eclipse at the same time. In other words, the incarnated Griffith could also be sacrificed. But considering that he's been enemies with the God Hands for 1,000 years, it might not be long after the incarnation that they became enemies. I'm afraid I can't guess what happened here at all. At this point, my head is about to explode. Well, it's complicated, so it's worth considering. Let's continue. In the Eclipse of the Void incarnation, it seems certain that Geyserik was killed by the power of the Berserker armor. I'm sure of it. But as you can see from the phrase beginning of a dead man stalking the endless night, Geyserik has been revived as the Skull Knight. This method of resurrection could be connected with the abomination that Flora committed. The armor that the Skull Knight is wearing now was made by Hanan. The Skull Knight was born with the forbidden resurrection spell by using the armor as a substitute. Guts and Casca escaped from the eclipse of Femto's reincarnation. At this time, Slan was staring at Void and said, "Or is this just another one of our predetermined fates?" And in the next frame, Void's face is drawn in a close-up. From this scene, the relationship between Void and Geyserik and the relationship between Griffith and Guts are connected by a thread of causality. If the incarnation from 1,000 years ago is Geyserik, then we can see the connection between Griffith and Geyserik. The causality is not a repetition, but a spiral. At the singularity, even the God Hands can't predict what will happen. A new cause and effect will arise by shifting as if you're wearing the wrong button. I'm sure that the Skull Knight and Lady Priestess of the Cherry Blossoms or Flora were in a fighting relationship like Guts and Shirka now, so it is certain that they started to have some kind of relationship at some point, but how that happened is still unknown. If Geyserik's lore is true, I don't think it's possible for the fairies to cooperate with him because he had been a tyrant. History is rewritten by rulers of each period, so it's possible that it was a lie that he had been a tyrant. It's also possible that what I've been saying is completely wrong. There is a theory that Void was actually Geyserik. Well, it's just a hypothetical.
Well, if the theory I have told you so far is correct, what is the ultimate purpose of the Skull Knight? I think there's a clue in the Sword of Beherits, which he created by kneading the Beherits he took from the apostles inside his body. The Sword of Beherits opens the boundary between the present world and the astral world and reaches into the crucible of dark thoughts. It cuts through dimensions and connects them as one. In this sense, there is a similarity with Void's ability to control dimensions. What is the inevitability of this ability? There is no doubt that Void and Geyserik have a connection, but there is a source that created it, the idea of evil, who appears in episode 83, not contained in the books. If Geyserik was the God Hand, I wouldn't be surprised if he came to know of its existence like Griffith in episode 83. I think the necessity of the existence of the Sword of Beherits is to get to this point. I'd like to leave the discussion of the idea of evil for another video. Well, how was it? This time I discussed the Skull Knight. There has been a recent revelation of his identity, but it's still a mystery. But I tried to think about him because I think he'll be the key to the future story. Well, I had a hard time. Please subscribe and don't forget to hit like and comment. Thank you for watching.